Guillermo Gonzalez came to the United States as a young boy, a refugee from Castro's Cuba. His family fled to America seeking freedom, with little more than clothes on their backs. As Guillermo grew up, he fell in love with science. He became a proverbial science geek. In fact, as a teen, he built a small observatory in his backyard. He spent hours looking up at the night sky. He still spends hours looking up at the night sky. He eventually earned a PhD in astronomy. He became an outstanding scientist who helped discover 2 new planets. He co-authored an astronomy textbook with Cambridge University Press. His research has been featured in Science, Nature, and on the cover of Scientific American. Yet despite producing 350% more peer-reviewed publications than needed to demonstrate research excellence in his department at Iowa State University, Guillermo Gonzalez was denied tenure and lost his job. He was denied tenure despite the fact that more than 95% of his colleagues who sought tenure at the year that he sought tenure were granted it. A public documents request later unearthed, documents request, by the way, that the university fought and actually threatened to sue us if we kept pursuing. But a public documents request later unearthed private emails from colleagues showing that Guillermo was rejected not because of his professional qualifications, which were outstanding, but because of a book he wrote called The Privileged Planet that argued that there was scientific evidence that the universe is the product of exquisite fine-tuning and intelligent design. Martin Gaskell, by all accounts, is another outstanding astronomer. He was a top applicant to become head of an observatory at the University of Kentucky. In the words of one university faculty member there, his qualifications stood far above those of any other applicant. But Gaskell was ultimately rejected for the job after not the astronomy faculty, but the biology faculty waged an internal war against him being chosen. Now, why did they want to prevent him from getting the job? Well, Gaskell was perceived by other faculty to be, and this is a quote from some of their emails, quote, potentially evangelical, unquote. Yes, that's a crime now, at least in academia. Even worse, although he identified himself as a theistic evolutionist, in notes for a science and faith talk, he respectfully discussed the views of intelligent design proponents and acknowledged that the modern evolutionary theory had unresolved problems just like any scientific theory. That was too much. There's a cost for being a person of faith in the sciences today. You heard about some of that last night. I wanted to make it more personal by sharing a couple of these stories. The cost can be especially high. That cost is fueled in large part by a meta-narrative of our history that views Christians in particular as a threat to science and society. You can see this secular meta-narrative in the news, in books, in novels, and in films. So is this an example of what you experience on Sunday mornings? Didn't think so. This is from the famous, or I should say infamous film, also Broadway play, actually made into different film versions too. This is the original one, called Inherit the Wind, highly fictionalized propagandistic version of the Scopes monkey trial. The reason I show it, even though it's an old film, this is actually shown, recommended to be shown in social science classes to teach about the history of science and faith in this country. The judge in the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision actually boasted to a reporter that he watched this film to get the historical context of this whole debate. So how are Christians portrayed there? Cult, okay. Fanatical, bigots, you name it. And this really has informed, when I talk to most reporters or others, this is almost the one thing that I can count on that somewhere, either during their high school education or college education or something else, this is where they're coming from. This is when they hear Christian Science, this is what they think about. The irony is that this meta-narrative about Christians and science is almost the complete reverse of the truth. Most Christians have never been anti-science. Indeed, Christians have had a lot to do with the birth and flowering of science. Sociologist Rodney Stark at Baylor University here in Texas, used to be at the University of Washington, Baylor stole him from us, is one of many scholars who have documented this fact. In his excellent book, For the Glory of God, Stark contends not only is there no inherent conflict between religion and science, but that Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. Stark argues that science had roots in the Christian Middle Ages and that the leading scientific figures in the 16th and 17th centuries overwhelmingly not just were nominal Christians, but were devout Christians who believed it their duty to comprehend God's handiwork. C.S. Lewis put it nicely in his book, Miracles. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. For the vast majority of early scientists, the ultimate purpose of science was indeed the glory of God. Now, if all this is true and about the origins of science, and I believe it is, how do we get from there to this? In 2005, researcher Elaine Eklund conducted a survey of nearly 1,700 professors in both the natural and social sciences at America's major research universities. According to the survey, as you can see, nearly 2/3 of these professors identify themselves as atheists and agnostics. What happened? What happened? Science is a good thing, a great and glorious thing, and we should never forget that. But over the past century, it has unfortunately often been hijacked to defend something that is not a good thing, something that some people call scientism or scientific materialism. The terms are really quite similar. Well, what is scientific materialism? Well, Joy Davidman, better known as Mrs. C.S. Lewis, aptly summarized the creed of scientific materialism, which she herself believed before becoming a Christian. In her words, according to this new secular creed, men are only apes, virtue is only custom, life is only an electrochemical reaction, mind is only a set of conditioned reflexes, love, art, and altruism are only sex, the universe is only matter. I forget what I said energy was only. That's a good definition of scientific materialism. Now, Charles Darwin played a key role in this story of the hijacking of science on behalf of scientism. And it's not because Darwin proposed that life had a long history. Lots of other people believed that before him. It's not primarily even because he proposed that humans had common ancestors with lower animals. Again, there were other people who proposed that before Darwin. No, the really radical part of Darwin's theory for culture is that he thought he had discovered a mechanism that showed how life, morality, even religion, developed as the product of a blind and unguided material process. That mechanism was natural selection, or survival of the fittest, acting on random variations found in nature. Now, it's critically important to understand that Darwin thought that natural selection was unguided, almost pretty much by definition. You can have a type of guided evolution, but that's not what Darwin proposed, and that really is not the modern mainstream theory of evolution held today. In Darwin's own words, the old argument of design, now I'm quoting him, in nature, the old argument of design in nature, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails. Why? Now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. Natural selection was a designer's substitute in his view. Now, it's often said that ideas have consequences, and I agree that that's true. And I think that this Darwinian idea that you can show through science that life and culture are the products of a blind and undirected material process has had tremendous implications for society as a whole, and also for Christians in that society. Darwinian biology has had these significant impacts on many areas, and in my short time with you, I'm going to discuss 4 of them. I talk about many of these things in much more detail in my writings in my book, Darwin Day in America, in my chapters in a book called God and Evolution, but I'm just going to sketch some things in our brief time today. The impact number 1 is the impact on faith. Now, you heard a little bit about, I think, Richard Dawkins last night, who's famously claimed that Darwin made it possible to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist. I think Dawkins has a point. Darwinian biology doesn't necessitate atheism, but if you really believe that biology supplies scientific proof that the history of life is the product of a blind and undirected process, then certainly that seems to make an atheist worldview seem a lot more credible, which may help explain why evolutionary biology, tragically, seems to attract far more atheists and agnostics than other scientific disciplines. According to a 2003 survey by Cornell University researchers of leading scientists just in the field of evolution, 87% deny the existence of God, 88% disbelieve in life after death, and 90% reject the idea that evolution is directed toward some higher purpose or some ultimate purpose. Then we have, more generally, according to a national survey of members of the most elite scientists of the National Academy of Sciences, nearly 95% of biologists, far more than any other discipline, more than physicists, more than engineers certainly, more than mathematicians, nearly 95% describe themselves as atheists or agnostics. Or then we have a survey published in 2007 of faculty at both 4-year and 2-year institutions where more than 60% of all college biology professors at both 2- and 4-year institutions consider themselves atheists or agnostics. Vastly different than even my neck of the woods, which is pretty unchurched in the Pacific Northwest, far more theist among the general population. Now, for many in academia and culture at large, Darwin's theory is not just a scientific theory, it functions as a kind of secular religion. You can see this, in fact, I would argue, in the widespread celebration of February 12th, which used to be known as Lincoln's birthday, as Darwin Day on many college, high school campuses, museums. Some of these Darwin Day celebrations take on all the trappings of a secular holy day, as you can see from, I'm going to show you a snippet of sort of a montage of things associated with Darwin Day, and I think you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. But Darwinism's impact in the area of faith isn't just on those who have become scientists or those who have become atheists. Indeed, perhaps its most significant impact is on the theology of many Christians. many of whom are increasingly tempted to embrace what might be called a Darwinian theology. Now, I think it's important that Christians take care in this area. In my view, I think Bible-believing Christians can have legitimate differences with others on many different points, and that includes science. I'm speaking for myself, not Discovery Institute. I'm speaking out of my personal testimony as a Christian. I do not believe that the Bible is a science textbook, and I think that we should be wary of being too preoccupied with issues like how to read the days in Genesis 1, lest we miss several more fundamental challenges that Orthodox Darwinian theory, I think, poses for a Judeo-Christian worldview. To be specific, I think that Darwinian theory has three watershed impacts on many Christians and how we think about God. First is an erosion in the belief in God's sovereignty and omniscience. Traditional biblical theism really holds that we and the rest of creation are the wondrous products of a loving and all-wise God who intentionally planned us from eternity. Yet, if Darwin's account of evolution is true, and it's truly an unguided process, then these doctrines believing in God's sovereignty and omniscience pretty much need to be abandoned or at least seriously watered down. Thus, we have people like prominent theistic evolutionists like Anglican John Polkinghorne, who says that an evolutionary universe is theologically understood as a creation allowed to make itself. Ponder that. We have George Coyne, a former Vatican astronomer, who claims that not even God could know with certainty that human life would come to be. Well, of course, if it's an unguided, undirected process, even God himself cannot know how it will turn out. Perhaps the most prominent, though, proponent of this particular view is Christian biologist Ken Miller of Brown University, author of the popular book Finding Darwin's God. That's used in many Christian colleges, including the one where I had tenure and was at for 12 years. Miller insists that evolution is an undirected process, just like Darwin, and flatly denies that God guided the evolutionary process to achieve any particular result, including the development of you and I. Indeed, he insists, and this is a quote you have up there, mankind's appearance on this planet was not preordained, that we are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in the history that might just as well have left us out. Now, Miller goes on to say on another page that basically God knew that this undirected process was so wonderful that it would create something capable of praising him eventually. But just what that something would be was completely unpredictable even to God. How unpredictable? Well, a few years ago, I was on a panel with Ken Miller, basically on educational policy, and so I pressed him on this, and he said, well, yes, okay, we create something, God knew it would create something capable of praising him. It could have been a big-brain dinosaur, these are his words, not mine, or a mollusk with exceptional mental capabilities, unquote, rather than human beings, and God really didn't know which. I'd say this view of God is deistic at best, a God who's so uninvolved in the details that he's perhaps unable, maybe even to be involved in the details, that he doesn't know how things are even going to turn out, let alone direct it. That's a pretty big, I said, impact on how Christians view God. The second impact, though, deals with an erosion in the belief that God originally created human beings morally good. Traditional Christian teaching, Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox believes that God originally created the world and human beings very good. Human beings started out in fellowship with God. Then things got messed up because human beings freely chose to reject God. That's the reason we need a Savior. This is really Christianity 101. But leading proponents of mainstream theistic Darwinism say that we have to jettison this view because it doesn't really fit with a Darwinian account. And you can see this, say, with Carl Giberson, who for many years was a physics professor at an evangelical college, Eastern Nazarene University, a co-founder with Francis Collins and Darrell Falk of the evangelical group known as BioLogos that promotes theistic evolution. Giberson has written a book called Saving Darwin. In that book, Giberson clearly repudiates what he says the old idea that sin originates in a free act of the first humans, and that God gave humans free will and they used it to contaminate the entire creation. Giberson basically argues that since we were created through Darwinian evolution, human beings were selfish because selfishness is what drives evolution. So there was no fall in his view because there was nothing to fall from. I just say this makes a hash of the Christian idea of salvation. If human beings were sinful to begin with, what is Christ saving you from? Perhaps God's original botched job. Essentially, this position argues that Christians should reject, the basic Christian message of salvation as it's been understood for the past 2 millennia by all major branches of Christianity. Then finally, we have this idea, an erosion of the belief that God's hand can be discerned through the evidence of nature. This traditional belief of Jews as well as Christians has been that nature supplies evidence of purposeful activity. You can find it in the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God. You can find it in the teachings of Jesus, talking about looking at the lilies of the field and other things, telling you something about God's character. Or, of course, famously in the Apostle Paul in Romans 1, where he talks about, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from that which was made, so that men are without an excuse. These beliefs really have been a main theme from the early church fathers of the church right down to the time of Darwin. Compare this view, Paul's view, with the view expressed by geneticist Francis Collins, probably the most prominent proponent of theistic evolution in America. Collins thinks that there may be some evidence of design when it comes to physics and astronomy, but when it comes to biology, he thinks that the evidence suggests we are the products of a blind and undirected process. Unlike Ken Miller, though, he recognizes that this wholesale embrace of an undirected form of evolution, rather than a guided form, is probably going to be a problem for many Christians, so he suggests sort of a way to split the difference. Perhaps, he argues, God was directing things in biology, but just made it look like they were random and undirected. As he says in his book, The Language of God, God could be, it's an interesting word, he uses could be, completely and intimately involved in the creation of all species, while from our perspective this would appear a random and undirected process. So in Collins' view, really God is what I would call the great cosmic trickster in the sky. He may direct biological history in some way, but he tricks us by making it look like it was random and undirected. Now, in a strange way, Collins on this point is further from, I'd say, the historic Christian position than arch-atheist Darwinist Richard Dawkins. And if you were here for last night, you might be able to understand why, but if not, I will refresh your memory. Dawkins argues that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So here you have Francis Collins, noted evangelical theistic proponent of evolution, arguing that you look at nature and it looks random and undirected. So the evidence of nature, it looks random and undirected, but through the eyes of faith, subjectively, we know that there must have been a God somehow at work, even though it looks random and undirected. You get over to the world's leading atheist, Richard Dawkins, and he says, no. You look, I have to admit, you look at biology, it looks designed. But I have evidence from science that shows that what looks and what appears to be so isn't the case. And then you, again, have Francis Collins say, no, it looks undesigned, but we know through the eyes of faith that it maybe did show some design. If you really tease out that difference and think about it for a while, I think you will realize just how sad, just how amazing that distinction is. And it shows you really, encapsulates in just a few seconds, the impact of Darwinian theory, not just on the culture at large, but on Christians, including self-described evangelical Christians. Now, we could spend our whole time on that, but I don't want to because I have lots others to say and want to leave some time for questions. Impact number 2, ethics. A second key cultural impact really is the Darwinian framework's promotion of a kind of ethical relativism. Now, Darwin thought his theory explained not merely the physical characteristics of human beings, but their mental and moral characteristics. So in his book, The Descent of Man, which was one of his the books that he wrote after Origin of Species, and how many of you have read The Descent of Man? A couple. I'm amazed by the academics and others who talk about whether Darwin's impact of his theory on society and ethics, who make all sorts of pronouncements who've actually never read Darwin's book on the subject. It's very illuminating. In that book, Darwin explicitly depicts morality as the evolving product of natural selection, rather than reflecting timeless standards of truth sanctioned by either God or reason or nature. Moral codes evolved by natural selection to promote physical survival. Thus, as the conditions for survival change, so too does that which is moral for any species. In one situation, maternal love might be called for, might be moral. In another situation, infanticide. In one situation, kindness might be moral. In another situation, cruelty. Now, Darwin was a kindly and proper Victorian, and so this isn't about demonizing Darwin. Darwin was a nice guy, treated his family well, he loved his kids. If he had a dog, probably would treat him well. I don't know off the top of my head if he had a dog. And so he surely hoped that modern society and that traditional morals were biologically beneficial in 19th century Britain. But the radical thing is he redefined morality to mean that which promotes and was selected for promoting biological survival. And once you redefine morality in that way, you have to admit that if circumstances change and those virtues no longer promote physical survival, they're no longer virtues. Because that's the definition of morality. Darwin himself admitted as much in a particularly startling passage that is too often just glanced over in The Descent of Man, where he compares human beings to hive bees. And he says this: if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. You can only mate with one, so all the others are expendable. And I would have to say that as much as my daughter sometimes gets frustrated with my son, I don't think, I'm glad that she doesn't take this to heart. This is a radical redefinition of, if the conditions for survival change, then what is moral radically changes. Now, whatever his own personal moral preferences, Darwin's reductionistic account of the development of morality left little room for objectively preferring one society's morality over another. According to Darwin's framework, every behavior that occurs regularly in at least some subpopulation is normal by almost definition. Moral and immoral behaviors develop for the same reason, according to Darwin, to promote biological survival. While for the most part, Darwin himself didn't press this relativistic analysis to its logical conclusion, he certainly laid the groundwork for others who came after him. And this view that morality is simply a product of what promotes biological survival under a given set of conditions really is at the heart of the ideology of many modern Darwinists as well, as can be seen from this quote by two noted Darwinians, one Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, the other noted Darwinian philosopher Michael Ruse, who argue this: morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion, fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Again, I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but think about what that would mean. Perhaps nowhere, I think, has this Darwinian view of ethics had more impact than in family life and human sexuality. Darwin argued that, ultimately there was, Darwin's followers end up arguing that ultimately there was no one right form of human mating because human mating practices were simply evolved by natural selection according to the changing conditions for survival. And Darwin's own account of this in The Descent of Man encouraged a relativistic understanding of marriage and sexual morality. Other thinkers soon followed in Darwin's footsteps. I trace this in my book, Darwin Day in America. But for here, I'm just going to say that perhaps the single most important Darwinian thinker in this area was a celebrated zoologist. Most people don't know he was trained as a zoologist, whose work revolutionized the understanding of human sexuality starting in the late 1940s, and that was Alfred Kinsey, trained at Harvard as an evolutionary zoologist. His book on male and female sexual practices, his books, ultimately transformed the content not only of our sex education in our schools, but in how we view sexuality as a culture. And his approach to sexuality was completely materialistic. Forget love, commitment, traditional mores. All that matters is whether some practice can be found somewhere, either among the lower animals or among humans. If it is, then the practice can be deemed, in his words, quote, normal mammalian behavior, unquote, and thus should be regarded as okay. This is a very Darwinian way of looking at it. If you find some subpopulation where some activity has persisted, that means it's just as biologically normal, and therefore, since that's the only standard, is just as good as any other behavior anywhere else in nature. Now, again, there's a lot more that we could say on that, but I want to go on. A third area where we've seen the impact of Darwinian theory and scientific materialism more generally is on the sanctity and value of human life, and it could keep you for hours on that. Be a very bleak several hours. But let me just sketch on this. In Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, it was largely devoted to proving that human beings really weren't all that special. We're simply animals. According to Darwin, we differ from the lower animals only in degree, not in kind. Moreover, the differences that do exist are the product not of a foreordained plan by a creator, but of this unguided interplay between chance and necessity in the form of natural selection acting on random variations. So, how did that impact things? Well, in the last century, you can see eminent scientists like Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson saying things like this. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind, unquote. Later, Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who died just a few years ago, similarly insisted that Darwinian, quote, biology took away our status as paragons created in the image of God, unquote. Today we see this type of ideological Darwinism inspiring attacks on human uniqueness, or sometimes known as human exceptionalism, on the political right as well as the left. From the right, consider John Derbyshire, the former go-to guy on science for the leading conservative publication National Review, until he was fired in 2012 for finally crossing the line by publishing a racist screed in another publication. His racism, though, was undergirded by, he thinks that evolution produces races of unequal and differential character. So it was actually underwritten by his Darwinian view. Rich Lowry and the people at National Review had no problem with his thoroughgoing social Darwinism in other areas, his virulent attacks on Catholics, on proponents of intelligent design, but the racist thing got too much for them. Well, what does Derbyshire argue? He argued that the Darwinian view of nature contradicts the biblical and more generally Western view that humans are unique, that we're a chosen species uniquely gifted by God with powers of moral discrimination and the prospect of an afterlife. I'm quoting him. In the words of Derbyshire, to modern biologists, which he supports, informed by Darwin, we're merely another branch on nature's tree. This infects the political right just as well as the political left. On the political left, we have Princeton bioethicist Peter Singer, who disparages handicapped newborns as of less value than healthy pigs. As he's written, the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Now, where does he get this from? Well, he has explained it, his own self-explanation in an interview a few years ago. All we are doing is catching up with Einstein. No, that's not what he said. All we are doing is catching up with the Bible. No, that's not what he said. All we are doing is catching up with Darwin. He showed in the 19th century that we are simply animals. Humans had imagined we were a separate part of creation, that there was some magical line between us and them. Darwin's theory undermined the foundations of that entire Western way of thinking about the place of our species in the universe, unquote. Now, I don't agree with Peter Singer on many things, but I happen to believe that his account for the way that Darwinian theory has undermined, sort of a social Darwinism has undermined this belief in human uniqueness, I think he's pretty much spot on. This same anti-human view can be found among certain radical environmentalists, which I would distinguish from sort of mainstream environmentalism, but there is a fringe which may be growing larger, like Christopher Maines. He was originally one of the early leaders in the group Earth First. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Green Rage, where he says this, and this is a quote, "Taken seriously, evolution means there is no basis for seeing humans as more advanced or developed than any other species. Homo sapiens is not the goal of evolution, for near as we can tell, evolution has no telos. It simply unfolds, life form after life form. Elephants are no more developed than toadstools. Fish are no less advanced than birds. Cabbages have as much ecological status as kings. Darwin invited humanity to face the fact that the observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence. The observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence that humankind is superior or special or even particularly more interesting than, say, lichen," unquote. These are not things I'm putting on people. These are their own self-explanations of what they believe. Or consider the views of evolutionary zoologist Eric Pianka, in case you're saying, oh, in Texas we don't have people who believe that. He's, of course, at the University of Texas, Austin. Paid for by your tax dollars. Dr. Pianka stresses that human beings are no more important than lizards or any other animal. Indeed, he thinks humans are a blight on the earth because they are producing too many people. He recommends eliminating up to 90% of the world's human population. And I'm even going to give him the benefit of the doubt. As some of you know about him, he was in a controversy a few years ago because he gave a lecture that seemed to imply that he thought the Ebola virus would be a great way of getting rid of people. He said he wasn't meaning to suggest that we do that he was just saying it would be effective. He wasn't advocating. So I'm taking him at his word that that's his view. Nonetheless, he does maintain that we need to get rid of up to 90% of the human population. And if you go to his website, as of every few months, I go check and download this document to make sure he's still saying this. He calls on the government to confiscate all the earnings of any couple who has more than 2 children. This is actually a cut and paste from this document, from this PDF on his website. So you can see that I'm not making this up, and you can go and verify it for yourself. This is what Pianka says. "People don't seem to want to think. We still allow people to have more than 2 kids. We encourage reproduction. We actually give you a discount for having kids." He obviously doesn't have many kids if he actually thinks that it's cheaper to have more kids. "You should have to pay more when you have your first kid." Well, I think if you have kids, you know that you probably do pay more. "You pay more taxes. When you have your second kid, you pay a lot more taxes. And when you have your third kid, you don't get anything back. They take it all. Our tax system is completely backwards, but then so is our whole economic system." Well, I might agree with him on that. Any tax system that pays his salary, to make arguments like that. People who don't think that ideas have consequences, I'd say, have not spent enough time in this subculture of what I would call ideological Darwinism in our country. Now, finally, sort of the final thing I want to mention, which I mentioned really sort of at the beginning, Darwinian theory in our culture has been a powerful justification for the stifling of free speech by people of faith in the sciences. According to many secularists, science is now supposed to prove that we're the products of a blind and purposeless process. Therefore, those who continue with the quaint belief that there is a God are regarded as irrational persons who should be muzzled, harassed, or even fired. The limits on what people of faith, including Christians, can and cannot say are getting more and more pronounced in the sciences. For example, computer administrator David Coppedge faced demotion and discharge at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, again, your tax dollars at work, after he offended his supervisor by doing what? Preaching? No. By occasionally offering to loan colleagues who wanted it DVDs about intelligent design. In fact, if you want to see what some of these horrific documentaries must have been, they're actually by Illustra Media, which he serves on the board of, and you can actually get them in back. Many of them have been shown on PBS stations. They must be awful. In fact, at least one of them features some people from the Jet Propulsion Lab. That was too much. When his supervisor, anti-religious supervisor, found out about it, he launched essentially a witch hunt against Coppedge. Coppedge's employment evaluations, he'd been there for like 15 years, which had been sky high, suddenly took a nosedive just after this, and he ultimately lost his job. They said, well, the reduction in force has nothing to do with these other things. Well, I happen to know David. He's a quiet man of integrity. He does not raise his voice. He's the least. You don't think of him as a fiery biblical prophet. He was a very kindly man. All he was doing was sharing in the same way as any worker there would, during lunch or after hours, would you like to see this DVD? And if they didn't, fine. That was too much. That lost him his job. And then he was smeared, vilified. My point that I want to make is that if you want to stand for truth in our culture, not just in science, but in other areas, you need to be prepared to pay a cost. Now, that's not necessarily bad. I'd actually say the greater the value of an idea, sometimes the higher the cost. The greater the stakes, the more that it may cost, and that may be an indication of its value. But I do think it may need to change an orientation of many American Christians who need to have a better understanding that Christianity, for most of its history, when it is being truly authentic, has been radically countercultural. And that means that for most of human history and most Christians around the world, say not in places like America, places in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, Christians aren't rich, they're not powerful, at least in human power. They're not popular with the existing culture. We live, after all, in a broken and fallen world. We're called nonetheless to be witnesses of a different way. We're called to be faithful, not necessarily successful or wealthy or beloved by existing elites. So rather than being proud, say, when someone who self-describes themselves as a Christian is, say, on the cover of Time magazine, or who's a popular sports star or something, we should be more concerned about well done, good and faithful servant. That is something that's tremendously positive. And I actually think that one reason our culture is fraying at the edges in many areas is because American Christians, not all, but a lot of American Christians, over the past few decades have increasingly sought popularity and worldly success at the expense of authenticity. So we self-censor ourselves, we dilute our message to such an extent that it ends up having no real power. So Christianity simply becomes a cultural construct, a country club, the place to be, but it doesn't demand anything, doesn't ask anything. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything. The cost of this self-censorship, I think, of not speaking truth to our culture is not just social, it's deeply personal. We become less authentic, less integrated, less whole. In the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King, in one of my favorite all-time quotes, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So my question for you is, are you willing to no longer be silent?